Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to our latest study, where we're taking a really expansive look at a fierce, honestly paradigm-shifting academic debate surrounding the origins of Islam. For decades, the history of the 7th century Middle East has just been presented as settled fact. Case closed, right? But a growing movement of historians, linguists, and archaeologists are stepping back and boldly challenging those accepted origins. And they aren't doing this just to be provocative, they're doing it by strictly examining the physical, tangible 7th century evidence left right there in the dirt. Rather than relying on accounts written hundreds of years later by distant empires, they're asking a fundamental question about what the contemporary artifacts, rock inscriptions, and geographic realities actually tell us about this incredibly pivotal era. Do the earliest historical sources actually support the traditional narrative we've all been taught? That is the historical mystery we're framing objectively today. We literally have to ask if the hard archaeology and contemporary writings match the traditions compiled much later. By the way, this entire study is a full summary based on an absolutely exhaustive, detailed discussion from our source channel, Events and History. I highly recommend you check the description box below for the link to their channel to see the original presentation and their rigorous methodology in its entirety. It's a goldmine.
To tackle this massive topic, here's our roadmap for the study. 1. The standard narrative. 2. Examining the geography. 3. The missing pagan evidence. 4. Jerusalem and the prophets. 5. Textual and historical clues. And finally, 6. Summarizing the findings. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The standard narrative, setting the historical baseline. Before we can really analyze the new research and emerging theories, we first have to expansively detail the baseline traditions, the ones compiled in the 9th and 10th centuries. So, what exactly is the standard narrative? Well, it's defined as this traditional account of a prophet revealing a sacred text to polytheistic pagans in 7th century Mecca, a narrative that ultimately paved the way for the great Arab conquests. This is the preconceived idea that has historically forced a very specific interpretation of foundational texts for centuries. But modern researchers are pointing out that this framework was essentially imposed backward onto the 7th century. They're now questioning whether the hard physical data actually supports this traditional view of a prophet emerging in a strictly isolated pagan Mecca.
Look at this stark comparison. On one side, we have the 9th and 10th century traditions. We're talking biographies and narratives compiled literally hundreds of years after the fact, often by victorious empires. On the other side, we have the 7th century evidence, the contemporary artifacts, coins, archaeology, and original texts from the exact time the events actually happened. Revisionist scholars are pushing to just start from scratch. They argue that to truly understand the origins, we have to put aside the later traditions for a moment and rely exclusively on what was actually in the ground and on the parchment during the 7th century. And this, right here, sets up the central, fascinating conflict of our study today.
Section 2. Examining the geography. The Middle East in the 7th century.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the researchers in our source material highlight some profound geopolitical anomalies that simply do not align with the standard narrative. When we look at the Arab presence in the 7th century, the geopolitical reality is massive. Arab tribes weren't isolated. They were deeply active everywhere. They were positioned all along the main Silk Road trade routes. They dwelled in major hubs like Damascus, Babylon, Yemen, and Petra. Crucially, they served as heavily armed, sophisticated auxiliaries for the warring Byzantine and Persian empires, positioned strictly on the frontiers of these superpowers. This massive, widespread, and politically engaged Arab presence is just oddly absent from the traditional story of an isolated Mecca. And here is where the geographical mismatch becomes incredibly glaring. The foundational texts repeatedly describe an environment with farmers cultivating vegetation, olive trees and pomegranates growing, and people fishing in both fresh and salt water. But the 7th century reality of Mecca? It was a harsh, barren desert. Absolutely nothing grows natively there. It's located deep inland with no freshwater seas or maritime access whatsoever. It was essentially a desert hamlet, utterly incapable of sustaining the kind of robust agricultural and maritime life described in the texts without the massive logistical support of an empire, which simply didn't exist in that region at the time. The text describes a lush Mediterranean environment, but Mecca is a desert.
Section 3. The missing pagan evidence, religion in the Hijaz.
If the central Hijaz region, where Mecca is located, wasn't capable of supporting these large populations, we really have to ask, who exactly was living there? And more importantly, if it wasn't the pagans we've always been told about, what was the actual religious landscape? Well, the archaeological findings here are quite shocking. 7th century archaeology shows absolutely no trace of active Arab pagan cults in the Hijaz. Literally none. Researchers and archaeologists have scoured the region for years, and this absolute lack of active paganism completely dismantles the baseline narrative of an ignorant, polytheistic environment in Central Arabia during this pivotal time.
Instead of paganism, what the hard evidence actually shows is early Arab Christianization. There was a well-documented 1st century Judeo-Christian presence in Arabia. We have 5th century Christian inscriptions carved right into rock found in Himyar, down in Yemen. We have historical records of Arab leaders being baptized by figures like Saint Euthemius and King Al-Numan III converting entire tribes in the late 6th century. But here's the catch. These documented Christians were up in the north, like the Ghassanids, or way down in the south, like Yemen. This leaves a mysterious, glaring big nowhere right in the middle Hijaz region, a complete blank spot of religious or civilian inactivity right where Mecca supposedly thrived.
Section 4. Jerusalem and the Prophets. A shift in geographic focus.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is, if the Hijaz is a barren big nowhere in the archaeological record, where does the text itself actually point? Let's look at the central role of Jerusalem. The traditional standard narrative asserts a strict Mecca focus, insisting the Hijaz is the absolute center of all events. But when scholars apply a rigorous Jerusalem focus to the text, things start to click into place. They find that the textual evidence frequently places key figures like Moses, Jesus, and Zechariah in the sanctuary or the temple. The early texts heavily imply that the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is the legitimate place of Abraham, rather than a sanctuary deep in the Meccan desert. To really understand this shift, we also need to define the term Nazarenes or Nasara. These were early Judeo-Christians, a group completely distinct from mainstream Christians who were known at the time as Masihim. The foundational texts confusingly described the Nazarenes as being both the closest allies and the bitterest enemies of the early believers. Historically speaking, mainstream Jews and Christians were arch-enemies during the brutal, bloody conflicts of the 7th century. This makes this textual alliance highly unusual and historically impossible unless we're talking about a very specific fringe Judeo-Christian sect operating up in the north.
Let's walk through the dynamic, rapid-fire timeline of the 7th century struggle for Jerusalem, just to see how these shifting alliances played out in real time. In 614 AD, a Persian and Jewish alliance actually takes Jerusalem from the Byzantines. Just 3 years later, in 617 AD, the Jews are betrayed and expelled from Jerusalem by those same Persians. Fast forward to 638 AD, the Arabs take Jerusalem, and historical records show they were actively guided by Jews. But the whiplash continues. Just 2 years later, in 640 AD, the Arabs expel the Jews from Jerusalem. This chaotic historical roller coaster perfectly mirrors the textual contradictions of Jewish and Christian groups being both vital allies and suddenly bitter enemies of the early Arab conquerors.
Section 5. Textual and historical clues. Examining external documents.
Now we're moving beyond just geographical deductions and looking at the hard, contemporary written evidence from completely outside the tradition. Take a look at this quote from a 7th century Byzantine propaganda text called the Doctrina Jacobi. It reads, "What can you tell me about the prophet who has appeared with the Saracens? They are waiting for the prophet that will be the precursor of the Messiah." This is an incredibly important contemporary clue. It suggests that among the Arabs, referred to here as the Saracens, who were fighting for the land of Canaan, there was a widespread expectation of a Jewish prophet. Not a completely new religion out of nowhere, but a continuation of the Judeo-Christian story.
Furthermore, we can connect the intense eschatological focus of these early believers to much older texts, like the Book of Joel, which states, "I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, the valley of decision." This demonstrates that Jerusalem, with its central rock and the surrounding valleys, was historically viewed as the ultimate apocalyptic gathering place for Judgment Day. This same fiery end-of-the-world concept is heavily present in early Islamic eschatology, deeply tying the movement's origins to the geography of Jerusalem rather than Mecca. To uncover these literal meanings hidden beneath centuries of tradition, scholars use a rigorous method called global exegesis. Now, global exegesis is an analytical approach that compares every single occurrence of an expression across an entire text to determine its true, literal meaning within its original historical context. It's like a giant puzzle. For example, by using global exegesis, researchers have successfully proven that the term forbidden place of worship historically referred directly to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which was strictly forbidden to Jews at the time, rather than a sanctuary down in Mecca.
Section 6. Summarizing the findings. A new historical pattern.
Okay, let's bring this all together. We're going to structure a detailed summary of how these disparate pieces of evidence, from geography to archaeology to textual analysis, form a cohesive new pattern that directly challenges those previous 9th century assumptions. The research journey these modern academics take follows 4 strict, impartial steps. First, discard unreliable 9th century traditions. Second, strictly analyze 7th century artifacts and rock inscriptions. Third, map the true geopolitical and geographical data of the era. And fourth, apply global exegesis to the original texts. This is an ongoing, rigorous academic investigation utilizing strict methodology to really uncover the truth of the past.
So the crucial point is this list of key discrepancies they've unearthed. Number 1, there is absolutely no physical evidence of 7th century active paganism in the Hijaz. 2, the geographic text descriptions of olive trees and oceans natively match the northern and southern Middle East, not the barren desert of Mecca. 3, early Arab origins are heavily, inextricably tied to Judeo-Christian history and sects. And finally, there is a massive eschatological focus on Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. The overwhelming physical and textual evidence points toward a strong Judeo-Christian influence and a northern geographic focus at the dawn of this movement.
Now, this entire full summary has been sourced from the incredible, painstaking work over at the Events and History channel. For your own deeper, independent study into this fascinating academic debate, please make sure you find the link in the description box below and check out their comprehensive discussions. They go into incredible depths that we really only scratched the surface of today. It's well worth your time.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If the foundational history of an entire era, a history accepted by millions for over a millennium, can be fundamentally rewritten by simply looking at actual 7th century artifacts, what other accepted narratives should we be questioning today? It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just a settled story in a textbook, it's always waiting to be rediscovered in the dirt. Thank you so much for joining this study, and keep seeking the evidence.